All right, so hello everybody and welcome on 99 Media. Today we are going to deep dive into an analysis of the crisis that characterizes, let's say, Western economies since the early 2007, 2008. And with us today there are two Marxist economists. We've got Professor Tonak, which is a professor of political economy and currently a research affiliate at the Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. And then we've got Sungur Savran from Turkey, chair of the Revolutionary Party and professor of economics at the Istanbul Okan University. Thank you very much, Ahmet and Sungur, for being with us today. So I've prepared a few questions to structure our conversation, and the very first one that I wanted to ask you is if you could clarify the difference between the terms recession and depression as terms that are normally designated to indicate periods of economic crisis. If we are living the aftermath of the so-called Third Great Depression, which were the other two? That would be a question that I wanted to ask you. And in particular, Professor Tonak has argued that since 2008, we have been in a Great Depression similar to the one that we experienced in the 1930s. Could you explain to us why you think this to be true, and also what are the causes behind the state of things?
Okay, I'll try to answer this question. Yes, you are right. As you pointed out, we call the current crisis, started around 2008, 2009, as the Third Great Depression. However, again, as we all know, the mainstream media especially label this as the so-called global financial crisis. So let me elaborate on the difference between depression and stagnation and recession or business cycles. We are, from our point of view, very clear that this is not a business cycle or recession, because it is not a brief period of decline, whatever way you measure this decline, as GDP growth rate, for example. And additionally, this is not manageable by regular adjustment of market forces or specific government policies, be it monetary policy or fiscal policy. And it is rather what we've been experiencing is a bit longer, substantial longer, actually, I should say. Sometimes takes several decades, as happened before, and generally requires this type of depressions, radical convulsions. It is not exclusively located in the economic sphere, and also in the political, ideological, and even military domains are very much affected by these types of crises. And two of them, at least, generally agreed, happened before. One is the so-called Long Depression between 1873 to all the way to 1899, according to some measurements, which was originally called, by the way, the Great Depression. But when the second one happened in 1929, and which is also called the Great Depression, 1929 all the way to the 1930s, recovery achieved in the 1940s in the US and much later in Europe. So that's the basic difference between depression and recession. And there are similarities, what we are experiencing currently and the previous depressions. For example, investment generally declined substantially as it happened, and unemployment increased in some instances, for example, in certain European countries, all the way to 30-40%. When you look at the youth unemployment, and it is generally and consistently much higher. Global trade substantially slowed down, and household wealth decline in a major way. For example, U.S. household lost approximately $16 trillion in wealth, primarily through declines in housing and stock markets. And global financial contagion also happened. And we all know the major problems in financial markets in Greece and Portugal, Italy, and Cyprus. So, and similar things happen in the Great Depression, especially. So we know that there are many parallels like that. I don't want to cite specific statistics and numbers, but those are the basic similarities. I just want to point out one more thing regarding your question. I think it helps us to discuss different theories of crisis to specify the one we are currently experiencing. That has to do with the issue of distinguishing the cause from the triggering factor. The 2008 crisis is generally referred to as the financial crisis because it started in the financial sector, and there were obviously triggering factors and certain areas that we could identify. For example, subprime mortgage problems and etc. There are problems associated with the derivatives market, for example. However, we consider those problems, failures and events as the triggering factors rather than the fundamental causes of the current depression. Instead, we focus on, in our analysis, structural contradictions as the leading cause of the current crisis. These structural contradictions we treat as, built-in contradictions, and the very nature of capitalism consists of these type of crises. If you want me to specify them, obviously the leading was profit motivation and capital accumulation based on surplus value extraction, and then the fundamental contradiction between capital and labor, but also capital to capital contradiction and warlike competition, I think, are quite definitional characteristics and leading contradictions of capitalism. Both capital to capital contradiction and, more importantly, capital labor contradictions compel capitalists to adopt new technology, enabling them to compete more effectively by reducing their costs and extracting greater surplus value from workers. However, the generalizations of these tendencies produces a decline in profitability, which is the cause of the current crisis. I think this gives you a general framework of our approach, and if we could further obviously distinguish this approach from the other competing theories within your radical theory. Okay.
Yes, thank you very much. By the way, I didn't specify what was the document that I'm referring to. You've published together with the Tricontinental Institute for Social Science, I think in 2023, a long dossier on the, let's say, a Marxian interpretation of economic crisis. And it also was followed by the publication of a book, which I guess is titled In the Tracks of Marx Capital, which I think has just been published this year. So in your book, you provide a detailed analysis of the different responses to the crisis. I mean, the different interpretations of the crisis from different economic perspectives, highlighting the presence of what you call a denialist, a Keynesian/realist, a Schumpeterian, and a Marxist school. Could you briefly outline the key ideas of each analysis and explain why you think that the Marxist one has an edge over the other theories?
Well, this time let me take over. Vorrei cominciare in italiano, salutare l'audienza in nome mio e in nome di Ahmet Tonak.
Sungur, sorry to interrupt you, but I think it would be better to leave it in English because it's going to go on our English channel.
But I'm not going to speak in Italian all the time. I was just...
okay, sorry. I'm moved by the fact that you speak Italian, by the way. It's always, I already told you, it's always... Thank you.
No, I mean, when you put up this up in YouTube, probably most of the people who will watch will be Italians, nonetheless. I mean, because no, you don't think
Possibly.
so? Possibly.
I don't. Well, I don't know.
Okay, okay. Um, well, okay. So you don't want me to read a poem by Nazım Hikmet in Italian, very short?
I definitely do. I want. Yeah, that's.
Okay, okay. I was just going to say that, um, in Italian, when I was talking in Italian, I was saying that, um, we would like to extend our feelings of solidarity to the Italian audience, and we express our wishes to fight together against rapacious imperialism and exploitative capitalism together in international unison. Now, the poem that I would like to read is very brief, so I don't think it will take up much time. It's titled Forse devo essere una nuvola, and I'm reading it now, una nuvola multicolore sopra del mare, una nave di argento su di esso, pesce grillo, pesce giallo in esso, alga blu nel fondo, un uomo nudo sulla riva, egli continua a pensare, ci deve essere una nuvola o un nave? Ci deve essere un pesca o muschio? Ci deve essere mio figlio, la mare, con la sua nuvola, con la sua nave, con il suo pesce e con la sua alga. So that's it. Now we can pass over to more disciplined manner in matters of economic crisis. Let me take up this question of the development of economic thought on economic crises over 2.5 centuries in a very brief nutshell. First of all, let's remember that the denialist school that we're talking about, and I'm going to explain in just a moment what that means, has been there for 2.5 centuries. Although the methods of analysis from Ricardo through the marginalists of the mid 19th century all the way to the post war neoclassical economics have changed very much. Nonetheless, the idea that markets are perfect in their functioning and in allocating resources and in bringing to equilibrium supply and demand for all goods and as a total, uh, that idea has remained throughout all these different schools of thinking. So the denialist school is really mainstream economics in general. What is it that they deny? They deny that crises are endemic to capitalism, that crises exist for systemic reasons within the capitalist mode of production. And so, why then, I mean, because these crises happen so obstinately throughout history, why, according to them, do these crises happen? They, in a certain sense, export the dynamics, the reasons for crisis outside of the system, explaining them by unexpected economic developments, like, for instance, the rise of commodity prices at a certain point, or extra economic factors such as wars and revolutions and other kinds of social unrest, or in most cases to misguided economic policies. And Marx famously said, and I paraphrase here, I don't quote him. Marx famously said that if, according to these people, if everything went according to the recipes of the textbooks, there would have been no crisis in history. So this kind of attitude, of course, is really, this is why we call them denialists. The denialist school is really looking to the other side when crises constantly happen under capitalism. Now, the Keynesians are, of course, much more realists in the sense that Keynes, this is why he called his book, he titled his book The General Theory. There are different situations in which there could be a good equilibrium, but also overheating in certain times, or crisis situations of underconsumption in others. Now, what happens in the case of Keynes is that he goes in the right direction, a step in the right direction, but he doesn't explain the regularity and the necessity of crises under capitalism. It's as if, if one were to give a simple example from another field, it's as if, the sun is a source of energy, and therefore heat and light comes from the sun. That is discovered, but the scientist does not say why every day the sun rises and every night the sun goes down. There is no explanation of that regularity and necessity of the phenomenon in question. In that sense, Keynes only goes halfway to the explanation of crises, while Marx, through his theory of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall that Ahmet Tonak explained in his answer to the first question, explains why crises come about regularly and more violently over time. Now, with respect to Schumpeter, he is the only one in the history of mainstream economics who explains why crises come with a regularity and why they are necessary for the functioning of capitalism. Capitalism is a system which is not planned, but has to work through spontaneous forces, the spontaneous forces of the market. Now, he says that crises are necessary in order for new technology, new and more advanced technology, obviously, to come into play, pushing out the old one, because within the crisis, many firms lose their own whole capital, etc., etc. I won't go into the detail, but this way, replacement of new technology becomes a possibility. There is a destructive moment here, the crisis, but also a creative moment because technology advances through the introduction of new techniques. Okay, now this he calls creative destruction. Creative destruction is really the recapitulation of two of Marx's laws of motion. One is, Marx very clearly said, well, this is one of the major laws of motion of capitalism, that capital cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the productive forces. And two, he asserts very clearly that periodic crises are a feature of capitalism. That is how capital develops over historical time. These two combined together give us the secret of creative destruction. But why is then Marx superior to Schumpeter in explaining crises and their import? Because crises are a Pandora's box. You don't know what is going to happen once the crisis has started. It could be that the crisis will sweep away not only the old technologies, the productive forces in existence, but also the relations of production, the capital relation, that is to say, the bases of the capitalist mode of production, through, of course, a political revolution as well. So, in that sense, Marx's approach to crises is superior to Schumpeter's as well.
I wanted to follow on this, let's say, slightly history of political thought type of analysis, in asking in which sense, if you could just dip a little bit deeper in the criticism of the Keynesianism, as a heuristic method to understand the crisis under capitalism? And why do you argue that his ultimate explanation of crisis avoids the development of a theory of production and indulges too much in so-called psychological explanation that are unable to understand the dynamics that are underlying these recurring crises?
Okay, yeah. This I'll come in again. This is really perhaps the fundamental question for Marxists and socialists in understanding crises and in responding to them. The difference between the Keynesian approach and the Marxist approach, because uh, this it is the most common thing to really attribute crises to underconsumption or the insufficient capacity of the large masses for consumption as
I've lost your audio, Sungur.
this is very strange because
No, now you're back. Now you're
ah,
back.
okay. Okay, there was a technical hitch, I suppose. Okay. Let me say it again then. That sentence is important. I don't think there is any technical solution to crises. The reason for this is when you say heuristic, I hear, a technical solution that would be to the good of all sections or sectors of society, all classes, etc. That is why I say there is no technical solution, because every crisis also brings in an exacerbation of the existing contradictions between the classes, so that any technical solution that is offered as a solution to the crisis will really come into contradiction with either one, the interests, sorry, of either one or another major class, and also enter into contradiction with some of the its interests of the minor classes. Now, I said that on the left, it is very common to say that Keynes really showed the way out of the crisis because he showed us the reason behind the crisis, which is a lack of uh, total effective demand due to the low capacity of consumption of the masses because of their poverty. Therefore, if we raise wages or the welfare state, as it is called, I think that's an ideological term, but never mind, then crisis can be solved to the interests of both the capitalists and the workers. Now, this is really not Keynes, because Keynes really did not say this. This is a very mistaken, misguided, popular interpretation of Keynes due to what Joan Robinson, one of the doyens of the economic science, called bastard Keynesianism at a certain point, and that is, the fact that the idea that consumption is the basic thing in this matter of lack of demand. No, Keynes said very clearly that is investment that is decisive. That it is investment that is in constant turbulence because the capitalists are in constant worry about the future of the rate of profit and the rate of interest and their relationship. Therefore, there is no heuristic in Keynesianism. Stock is raising demand through all kinds of investments and expenditures does not solve the crisis. It really is a palliative that Keynes really put forward. The real solution to the crisis for Keynes himself too is the rise in the rate of profit, not in the raise in wages. So in that sense, there is no solution based on the Keynesian framework that would serve the interests of the working class and the capitalists.
All right, thank you. I'm going to move on to another question. In your contribution, you distinguish between three versions of Marxian theories of crisis. You call them, one of them is the so-called the profit squeeze theory. Then we've got an underconsumptionist approach, and one that relates directly to the law of the tendency of the profit rate to fall. So I was going to ask if you could summarize those three theories and highlighting the differences between the three. Also, I assume that you personally would favor one over the other, but don't you think that all three do bring valid points and therefore should possibly be considered as complementary rather than mutually exclusive? Or would that result instead in an eclectic theory that might be good for explanations but not for predictions? So I'm wondering how much those are compatible or not. And what is your personal take of the theory put forward by Ernst Mandel in his Long Waves of Capital Accumulation?
Okay. I would like to emphasize one point before I go into the discussion of these three different schools of explanation, crisis explanation on the Marxist left, and that is these theories do not only explain crises, but they also show different paths towards the solution of the crisis. Therefore, they really act as guides to how the working class will fight against the results of the crisis, all the poverty and misery caused by crises, and how they're going to fight the capitalist class for that. Now, therefore, each theory gives us a recipe, so to speak, as to what we should be doing in order to solve the problems created by the crisis for the working class, since these are Marxist theories. In that sense, there could be no synthesis between these three theories in approaching the different aspects of the crisis. Here, I would also like to bring in the discussion Ahmet made between the triggering factors and the real causes of the crisis, because some of these factors that are mentioned by the profit squeeze theory and the underconsumption theory, these are the two theories that we criticize, and we own up the theory of the falling rate of profit. The theories that we criticize really deal with triggering factors or manifestations of crises rather than the deep dynamics, the deep causes of the crisis. Now, let me make a very simple kind of characterization of the three for our audience, because not everyone is constantly working on these. With respect to the profit squeeze, the idea here is the fall in profits because of a tight labor market, that is to say, full employment, raising wages, working in the favor of the working class, which was, of course, the case in the mid-1970s, although the crisis wasn't due to this, in our opinion. But that is what they based their argument upon. With respect to underconsumption, well, I think our audience should always think of what I said about Keynesianism in its popular version in the previous discussion on Keynes, because here the idea is insufficient demand due to the poverty of the masses, to the insufficient capacity of masses to buy consumption goods. With respect to the fall in the rate of profit, Ahmet already explained it, but let me say that this dwells in the sphere of accumulation, in the center of which, in the nucleus of which, there is the contradictions of the production process. Now, immediately I pass on to the second point. For Marx and all Marxists, I think should approach the question of economic crisis with the
I think we've had again the issue with the
yes.
microphone.
Can you hear me now?
You are
Can you
back
hear me
again.
now?
Yeah, just the
Well,
last 10 seconds, really.
apparently there is an internet problem now in my case. Possibly, I don't know. It's
No,
not
but we
completely.
only missed a few
Okay,
sentences.
okay, okay. What I would like to say here is that at, on the when it's a question of taking up the falling rate of profit explanation, this resides in the sphere of production, which for Marx is the fundamental sphere of economic activity because uh, surplus value is produced there. On the other hand, the others rest in the are situated in the sphere of circulation, of demand, of the market. So this immediately gives an advantage to the falling rate of profit argument over the others. But also, the others have been proved fallacious in the development of the crisis itself. How? First of all, taking up the profit squeeze explanation, uh, well, their idea that wages were high and that's why there was a squeeze on profits really fell by the way because uh, this situation has totally changed. Wages are very low now than they had been before for 30 years. There has been impoverishment even in imperialist countries, etc. But the crisis is not only not over, but is really deepening, especially since 2008. With respect to the underconsumptionists, what happens is this. I mean, um, if the underconsumptionist uh, idea were correct, then governments could really have done things in order to raise the purchasing power of the masses so that this would, go into making up for lack of demand and solve the crisis. But on the contrary, they have been attacking wages and all kinds of, social wage elements that there exist in the so-called welfare state for the last I don't know how many years, 3 or 4 decades, and therefore this shows that the crisis really does not
We lost you again for a moment.
This is incredible. Yeah, this doesn't really happen. I have very good internet connection, but unfortunately. Anyway, let me finish off by saying that there are Marxists of um, very renowned Marxists who keep saying if only the capitalists knew that they could have solved the crisis by raising wages, then we would have gotten over with the crisis a long time ago. This is a very strange kind of reasoning, I find, and not worthy of the Marxists. Now, as for Mandel, we share the idea that Mandel was the greatest Marxist economist of the second half, at least, of the 20th century. Now, I pass it over to Ahmet Tonak. He's going to talk about the falling rate of profit and Mandel's position within the crisis debate.
Thank you, Sungur.
Okay. Let me say a couple of things in addition to what Sungur already outlined regarding these theories, specifically about the falling rate of profit theory. Uh, okay. First of all, just to reiterate, I mean, what exactly we refer to when we talk about the falling rate of profit. Instead, I mean, in terms of the rate itself, I mean, what this rate uh, in itself, contains, and why this matters to capitalists who invest in order to make profit and more profit, and invest more and more steadily, so to speak. This ratio, this rate itself, consists of surplus value that capitalists extract from laborers as numerator, top of the ratio, so to speak, and divided by total investment. Total investment, according to Marxist formulation, consists of two things: all the materials and means of production that you use and you need in order to produce all these commodities, what Marx broadly called constant capital, and plus obviously part of the total investment that capitalists must make, wages and salaries paid to these workers. So therefore you have profit or surplus value on top of the ratio divided by total investment. And this obviously can be estimated and observed by individual companies, but also on average by for the total economy, right, a national economy. So when we talk about this declining rate of profit, we refer to average general rate of profit in a national economy. So there are reasons, as I partially touch upon answering to your first question, behind this kind of long-term tendency that has to do with the fact that obviously capital-labor contradiction, but also capital-to-capital war-like competition, which force individual capitalists constantly advance new technology and use more machinery in place of living labor. When this tendency, which is valid for every competing capitalist enterprise, generalize, and it produces basically long-term, what is generally called secular tendency of the rate of profit to decline. So what I'm showing here in this graph, this is not just a theoretical assertion, so to speak. It is not just one of the predictions that Marx made, and it is actually empirically realized phenomenon. There are many competing estimates to look at nationwide or globally or a group of advanced countries regarding their general rate of profit and how it behaves. For example, this one is generated by Deepankar Basu at University of Massachusetts Amherst Economics Department and with his colleagues. There is a reference here, Basu, and his friends recently published actually this article in Review of Political Economy. As you see, this is global annual rate of profit based on 37 countries. And what you see basically from 1960 all the way, mid 2000, and actually their estimates come all the way 2020s now. This blue dotted line is the average tendency of essentially two periods. One period is 1960 all the way to let's say early 1980s, which is also basically had sharper decline, red dot lines, and also the rest of the period, mid 1980s all the way, early 2000, which is indicated here, dotted, green line. But when you put together these two sub periods with these blue dotted lines, there is an overall tendency of the profit rate decline. So that is also empirically shown. Obviously, there are debates among Marxist economists how to estimate these things, whether cost of capital should be calculated in terms of the current prices or historical prices, whether unproductive productive labor distinction plays an important role. To us, they play, and actually they make, when they are incorporated into empirical estimates, these declines generally become much more pronounced. So this is I think one thing we should know in terms of falling rate of profit. It is above and beyond just theoretical assertion and one of speculative predictions of Marx or the followers of Marx. It is also empirically tested and proven and demonstrated by many Marxist economists. Now, regarding long wage, especially Mandels's contribution, I should say the following: Mandels's theory of long waves, especially in terms of his writings and contributions in the 1970s and 1980s, built on the original empirical patterns of price movements identified by Russian statistician Nikolai Kondratyev. According to Kondratyev, these price movements exhibited a pattern, and typically, basically, every 44 years, you could identify a big cycle, big wave, so to speak. Initial, 20 or 21 years or 22 years, basically upswing, and prices, increase, and then basically another, similar period of time, 20 to 22 years, basically prices decline. So these waves somehow repeated, themselves. Mandel himself argued that these long waves are actually waves of profit rates, rather than by looking at the price patterns. And he suggested that let's look at profit rates and how they behave. And he observed that profit rates themselves exhibit similar long wave patterns. And then the important question is obviously what kind of factors generate these kind of long waves. And he, meaning Mandel, suggested that external factors lead to a rise in rate of profit initially, in the initial phase of this long wave, which accelerates capital accumulation. But this increase in accumulation inevitably raises the organic composition of capital, which means that you have constant capital, all the means of production that cost to capital divided by wages and salaries. That's what Marx called organic composition of capital. That must go up because of the competition, because of the investment needed to expand, this accumulation by, capitalists. So as this goes up, meaning organic composition of capital goes up, and eventually reduces the rate of profit and causing the economy to enter a prolonged, downturn. So in his own framework, therefore, there is an explanation by referring to external factors, upswing of rate of profit and increased capital accumulation, forcing basically capitalists advance technology, increase organic composition of capital, which obviously, when generalized and create a reduction in profit rate, that explains also the downturn phase of the long wave. And this is very interesting, and this basically was kind of new contribution at the time by Mandel to Marxian discussion of crisis theories. And in fact, Mandel's contributions generated different type of interpretations of this theory. For example, the proponents of the world system theory, I mean Wallerstein chiefly, but also Andre Günther Frank, reinterpreted Mandel's contribution. For them, obviously, instead of national economy and profit rate behavior within national economy, rather the world system, world economy, and the rate of profit, but also more important, the hegemonic powers exerting themselves as the leading powers and losing their hegemonic power became more important in explaining these long waves, so to speak. And also Mandel's contribution generated debate among Marxist economists. For example, my good friend and my co-author Anwar Sheikh proposed that long waves are not triggered by external factors, but rather internally generated phenomenon by the tendency of the profit rate to fall and the capitalist response to that tendency. What we observe in terms of behavior of variable going up and going down is actually a mass of surplus rather than profit rate itself. So that's what I can say in terms of Mandel's contribution through long waves. Okay.
Thank you very much, Ahmet. Towards the end of your essay, you emphasize how, and I'm quoting, each mode of is superseded as a result of the internal contradictions that it embeds between the development of the forces of production and its codified relationships of production. Applying this to our times, we could trace in the development of a globalized productive capital managed by great monopolies as an evolution of the structure of the productive forces that is potentially in contradiction with the relationships of production, which is private property of the means of production that regulates them. So if we were to translate this analysis into a list of policy measures to take, which steps we would take for a socialist progressive transformation of our societies, and which will be the sectors of the economy in which you reckon that seizing the means of production nowadays is more than ever an historical necessity?
Okay, I mean, the basis, or actually the background of your question is our reference to Marx's general vision of history in his famous, preface to 1859 book, Contribution to the Critical Political Economy. There is many of people in the audience know Marx formulates the conditions in which societies move from one mode of production to another one, from one type of society to another one, including, from feudalism to capitalism, but more importantly for us and relevant, obviously, from capitalism to post-capitalism and socialist type of society. The conditions essentially he formulated have to do with the fact that at some point there is the maturity of the contradiction between productive forces on the one hand and relations of production. And this is not a formulation, by the way, exclusively he made himself in 1859 book preface. Before that, he and Engels also discussed a similar issue in 1848 in the Communist Manifesto. And it was not an abstract idea for Marx. And he continued to explore this fundamental contradiction, predicting concrete examples of the development of productive forces in Capital Volume 1, published in 1867. So let me list some of these predictions by Marx directly from Capital. For example, he referred to the cooperative form of the labor process as one of the things happening, and actually it's going to be intensified as capitalism develops. And secondly, transformation of instruments of labor into instruments of labor only usable in common. They're not anymore just singular labor use tools, so to speak. And then he also identified another process, another evidence in terms of development of productive forces, that the economizing of all means of production by their use as the means of production of combined and socialized labor. And then more importantly, and as I will say in a minute, I think related to directly to your question, that the centralization of capital. And obviously, he also discussed the concentration of capital. And then he continued and emphasized the conscious technical application of science, and as well as some developments, productive forces development in the agricultural sector, by saying that the methodological cultivation of the soil. So what you call monopolies in your question is the process or phenomenon that Marx identifies as the centralization and concentration of capital. This process, in my view, should not be understood as the disappearance of competition among capitalists and their complete ability to control the development of productive forces, thereby delaying the maturity of transformational conditions indefinitely, meaning that contradiction between level of development of productive forces and relations of production within which basically this development take place. The most dramatic example of capitalist inability to manage productive forces comes from the current ecological crisis that we did not actually analyze and focus on in our piece. The nature of warlike competition among, for example, oil, coal, and natural gas companies not only produced very advanced technologies, take, for example, fracking, but at the same time, their incompatibility with the existing relations of production. Moreover, they also produce global warming and its uncontrollable disasters, which may trigger the forthcoming financial collapse. I mean, this is not a speculation I'm making here. This was actually explored by the Financial Times recently, 2 weeks ago, allocating 2 full page on this possibility, specifically the impact of global warming and raising basically sea levels, wiping out huge amount of real estate, and therefore generating possibly collapse of insurance sector. In the United States, also some of the European countries exposed to this kind of chaotic situation, which basically trigger possibly more devastating financial collapse than 2008. And actually, the very title of Financial Times article is "Meltdown: How the Next Financial Crisis Starts." So I consider this is very much related to actually your question, and then Marxist vision of development of productive forces and what they may produce within capitalist context, and which basically create conditions to overcome capitalist relations in some respect. So Sungur may answer the last part of your question about the socialist transformation. Okay. Sungur?
Okay, let me come in. Can I? Yes, Carlo?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. No, I'll be brief on this because, we don't have any blueprint as to how the working class and its allies will move or will be able to move towards a control of the economy so as to apply socialist policies in the near future. We know that things have happened, for instance, very differently in the revolutionary wave after the First World War and in the revolutionary wave after the Second World War as well. And we can also bring other periods as well. So it depends on which countries, in which countries, the working class will be more powerful in the near future than it is now, and how it can really intervene in the working of the economy. Let me, put this in a succinct way. I think the first policy for working class deliverance from crisis and capitalism is revolution. Because you see, when the whole economy is under the power of the capitalists, when private property and the market have the last say in the development of the economy all around the world, then there can be no socialist transformations really to be carried out, but only palliatives that answer to this or that sectional or partial questions. So we should not forget that the question of political power, whether revolution or anything else, I mean, this of course is debatable among socialists, but the control of political power is the first thing that is necessary in order to push the world economy in a totally different manner. I think we should talk about the political aspects in this overall context and not with respect to this or that specific aspect of economic policy.
Okay, just as a final question, which I think links quite nicely to what you were just saying now. So if we, I think I also agree with this reading of the deepening of the economic tensions and in general a crisis, especially for Western capitalist countries to manage this crisis of profitability. Which type of implications do you think are at play for like political movements that might take advantage of this situation? Because if we try also to link it to the international scenario, we clearly have got a Western decadent imperialist order. And I will say, personally, I think I am quite lenient on the interpretation of China as a society that, even though non-socialistic, is clearly different from a capitalist state. So how do you think that this crisis of Western capitalism will evolve? Is war the most likely outcome, or will there be space for some other, hopefully, solution to this international situation?
Okay. One aspect, I think, and this, I think we're finishing. Perhaps Ahmet would like to add something at the end, but we're finishing off, I think, with the correct aspect of things, and that is, how does this whole economic crisis that we call a Great Depression, that of course has its source in, as you say, the advanced economies of the imperialist countries, including Japan and perhaps South Korea, etc., not only the West, I mean. The question of this crisis in its relation to what is happening in the world right now in the political sphere, in the diplomatic sphere, and the military possibilities that arise as a result of this. Really, people do not tie these, I mean, not very many commentators tie these things in together in a very reasonable or credible manner. Let me say very clearly, I want to be very clear on this. The details can come later, but I would like to make the following observation. It is this great, I see. Have I come back? Yes?
Yes, now you've come back.
Yeah, okay. I think this Great Depression is the background, the material background of several political developments of immense importance within the last several years or a decade or so. First, the bourgeoisie has lost control of how it can come out of the crisis, through which policies, etc. It adopted the policy of globalization and neoliberalism, one after the other, first neoliberalism and then the globalism aspect. But in 2008, the whole world witnessed the fact that this collapsed, especially the globalization aspect. There is now a pre-period, a process of deglobalization. Again, I think I've gone, but I come back. The only method through which they can solve the crisis has now collapsed. The only method, because this is an internationally integrated economy. So, in that sense, more globalism, they thought, would help them to solve overall problems. But now that has collapsed, and there is now a resurgence of nationalism, as in the 1930s, a resurgence of trade wars and potential military wars. The other aspect is this matter of potential wars, which you have already mentioned, that is to say, because China and Russia, even though they have lost their clout in as socialist forces, they have unfortunately exhausted that, nonetheless, still form a threat to the domination of the Western imperialist alliance plus Japan, let's put it that way, over the entire world system. Therefore, the threat of a military conflagration also is on the rise. The first question of nationalism, I skipped that. Let me come back to that. That question of nationalism as a solution, say, to American problems. MAGA, what is that? The Make America Great Again movement really is a
Sorry, Sungur is gone again.
is incredible.
I think we I
Good.
think we
Yeah.
get the idea.
We could wind up now. Okay. The MAGA movement, I said, is a fascist movement in the sense of national salvation for national sectors of capital rather than international solution to a capitalist crisis on the basis of a cooperation of capitalist countries. The second aspect is war, but there is a third aspect. There have been revolutionary movements since 2011, and that has gone through different waves of revolutionary movements, the Arab Spring, and then the 2018, 2019 struggles in many countries. There have been mass upheavals that brought down governments and looked for new solutions. They have not been successful at all for the moment because of the big crisis of the socialist movement. So, what should be done is really to rearm the working class with socialism because the working class now is really looking for another solution, which shows in the fact that they go to support fascist forces such as Trump on the one hand, or Le Pen in France, or Meloni in Italy. So, what we should be doing is go back to the roots of the movement and make the left again primarily a movement of the working class in alliance with all the oppressed. That is an assumption for Leninist policy. The working class will not triumph on its own. It will only triumph if it brings together under its program the different kinds of oppressed sections of society that also fight for their rights for the future. Therefore, what we should do is really to form working class parties that are revolutionary in nature and not forget that the revolution can only succeed if it's international. Only world revolution can bring us a solution to this crisis. Otherwise, I would say it's again back to Rosa Luxemburg, socialism or barbarism.
Thank you, Sungur. I don't know if Ahmet, do you want to say something as well?
Yeah, I just want to say, briefly that I generally share with Sungur's evaluation and analysis of the current political situation, and especially, I think it is very important to realize, what he emphasized on the fact that in the absence of, effective, left movement based on working class organizational, potential, so to speak, and action, potential, that the right and the fascists and all other forms of, conservative, ideologies become and became significant, influencing the working class potentiality and for, the fascistic type, actions and political, positions, as It happens in the United States, currently, and obviously as it happens in our own country, Turkey. So I think this is a real danger, and I think we should act on it, so to speak. Additionally, I would like to thank to you personally and to invite us to this event, and and I wish great success of your festival. All right.
Thank you very much. It was great to have you, and hopefully we will discuss something in the future as well.
Thank you.
Okay.